The sound of my golf cleats clicking against the garage floor announced my early return home. An unexpected October downpour had cut short my Saturday morning on the course. I'd left 3 hours ago expecting to work on my short game, but instead found myself pulling into my driveway before noon, dripping wet and slightly annoyed. As I stepped through the door into our kitchen, I immediately noticed something different. Instead of the usual quiet Saturday afternoon, there were voices coming from our living room. Not casual chatter, but something organized, purposeful. The tone was serious, almost businesslike. I set my golf bag down quietly and listened. 5 distinct voices, all women. They were discussing something with conference room focus, using words like implementation, strategy, and systematic approach. This wasn't the usual gossip session. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward the living room, my golf shoes now silent on the hardwood floor. What I saw when I reached the doorway stopped me cold. Our living room had been transformed into a seminar room. 5 women sat in a perfect circle, each with notebooks and printed materials spread across our coffee table. My wife Jess was holding what looked like a printed list, more animated than I'd seen her in months. Amanda Cooper was leading this gathering. Recently divorced and intensely interested in other people's relationships, she was clearly running this meeting with printed materials arranged like a teacher's desk. The others I recognized from neighborhood gatherings. Rachel Williams, newly married and seeking advice. Nicole Thompson, whose marriage had been rocky for years. And Kelly Brooks, perpetually single but always opinionated about married couples. But what struck me most was the atmosphere. These women weren't just chatting. They were working. This was organized, planned, and clearly ongoing. And remember, Amanda was saying as I stood unnoticed in the doorway, the key is presentation. Don't frame it as rules. Frame it as relationship improvements that you've researched and want to implement together. That's when Jess looked up and saw me standing there. Instead of looking embarrassed or surprised, her face lit up with excitement. "Rob, perfect timing," she said, waving me into the room. "You have to hear what we've been working on. This is going to change everything." I stepped into the room, noting how all 5 women turned to look at me with expressions that ranged from curious to expectant. Whatever they'd been working on, they clearly felt confident about it. "Change everything?" I asked, settling into the armchair that faced their little circle. "That sounds pretty ambitious for a Saturday afternoon." Amanda straightened up, clearly ready to take charge of the presentation. "We've been developing what we call relationship optimization guidelines. It's a comprehensive system for improving marriage satisfaction and husband behavior based on proven psychological principles." The way she said husband behavior made something cold settle in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. "That sounds very thorough. How long have you been working on this?" 6 weeks, Jess said proudly. "We've been meeting every Saturday morning at the coffee shop in German Village. But today Amanda suggested we come here so we could really spread out our materials and finalize everything." 6 weeks. They'd been meeting for 6 weeks developing this system, and this was the first I'd heard of it. I looked around at the materials scattered across my coffee table. Printed articles, handwritten notes, what appeared to be charts and graphs. This wasn't a casual project. This was research. "I'm impressed by your dedication," I said, and I meant it. Not because I approved of what they were doing, but because the scope of their effort was genuinely surprising. "What kind of guidelines are we talking about?" Rachel leaned forward eagerly. "Oh, we've got 20 different areas of improvement. Everything from communication to financial responsibility to social behavior." 20 different areas, I repeated. "That's comprehensive indeed. I'd love to hear more about your research methodology. What sources are you using?" The questions seemed to energize them even more. Amanda pulled out a stack of printed pages. "We've been studying relationship psychology articles, marriage counseling techniques, and success stories from other couples who've implemented structured approaches." "Structured approaches," I said thoughtfully. "And these would be implemented how exactly?" "Well, that's the beauty of the system," Jess said, her excitement growing. "It's not about demanding changes. It's about creating a framework that naturally encourages better behavior patterns." I nodded encouragingly. "Could you walk me through some examples? I want to make sure I understand the full scope of what you're proposing." Amanda consulted her notes. Guideline number 1. All financial decisions over $100 require pre-approval from the wife to ensure fiscal responsibility. Guideline number 2. weekly relationship performance reviews to maintain open communication. As she continued reading, I realized they'd created a comprehensive manual for turning husbands into controlled, managed versions of themselves. Every aspect of male behavior had been categorized and regulated according to their collective preferences. When she finished reading all 20 guidelines, I sat back, fascinated by the psychology playing out in front of me. These women had convinced themselves they were relationship experts. What happens if someone doesn't want to participate in this system? I asked. The question seemed to puzzle them. They'd apparently spent so much time developing their system that they hadn't seriously considered resistance. Most resistance comes from not understanding the benefits, Amanda said. Once they see how much better things can be, they'll want to participate. And if they still don't want to, then they're choosing to prioritize their own comfort over the health of their marriage, Kelly said. And there are natural consequences for that kind of selfishness. There it was. The nuclear option. Comply with their system or risk losing your marriage. So your husbands have no idea you've been developing this system? The silence that followed answered my question. These women had spent 6 weeks secretly developing a system to control their husbands, planning to present it as a fait accompli. I think that's actually smart planning, I said, which seemed to relieve them. It shows you're serious about this. But I have one question before you finalize everything. What's that? Amanda asked. If this system is really about creating better partnerships through mutual improvement, shouldn't it include guidelines for both partners? Are there corresponding requirements for wives? The question caught them completely off guard. They looked at each other with expressions that suggested this possibility had never occurred to them. Well, wives naturally regulate themselves, Amanda said slowly. We don't need external guidelines because we're already focused on relationship success. The arrogance was stunning. They'd convinced themselves that they were inherently superior partners who needed no oversight, while their husbands were defective humans requiring constant management. That makes sense, I said agreeably. So this is essentially a one-way system. Wives create guidelines, husbands follow them, and there's no reciprocal structure. Right, Jess confirmed, though she looked slightly uncertain about my line of questioning. I leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine interest. I have to say, this is fascinating from a psychological perspective. You've essentially created a comprehensive framework for relationship management. But I'm curious about the implementation strategy. How do you plan to introduce this system to ensure the best possible reception? They perked up at the question, clearly excited to discuss their rollout strategy. Amanda consulted another set of notes. We've developed a phased approach, she said. First, we introduce the concept as mutual improvement goals. Then we gradually implement the guidelines over several weeks so it doesn't feel overwhelming. And if there's resistance during the implementation phase, that's where the social support network comes in, Nicole explained. We'll be implementing this across multiple marriages simultaneously, so there's built-in peer pressure and accountability. Peer pressure, I said thoughtfully. Through the wives or through the husbands themselves? Both, Kelly said. The wives can coordinate their approaches, and the husbands can see that this isn't just one woman's idea. It's a proven system that multiple couples are using successfully. I sat back in my chair, genuinely amazed by the scope of their planning. They'd thought of everything except the most obvious question. What if their husbands simply refuse to be managed like children? This is really impressive work, I said. You've clearly put tremendous thought into every aspect of this system. But I think there's one element that might strengthen your approach even further. What's that? Jess asked eagerly. Well, if this is really about fairness and mutual improvement, I think it would be helpful to demonstrate that the system works both ways. Maybe we could add one guideline that applies to wives, just to show that everyone is committed to growth. The suggestion seemed reasonable enough that they couldn't immediately object, though I could see Amanda trying to figure out where I was going with this. What kind of guideline? She asked cautiously. I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Just something simple that shows wives are also willing to be held accountable for their behavior in the relationship. Like what? I stood up slowly, taking my time, letting the anticipation build in the room. These women had spent the afternoon feeling confident and in control, developing their system for managing their husbands. They had no idea they were about to learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of someone else's rules. Here's what I'm thinking, I said, adopting the same authoritative tone Amanda had been using. Any woman who participates in creating secret guidelines to control her husband automatically demonstrates that she believes spouses should have the authority to create behavioral requirements for their partners. The room went quiet as they processed what I'd just said. I could see the wheels turning as they tried to figure out whether this was going where they thought it might be going. What does that mean exactly? Jess asked, though her voice had lost all its earlier confidence. It means, I said, maintaining my calm, conversational tone, that by establishing the principle that spouses can unilaterally create binding guidelines for each other, you've opened the door for reciprocal treatment. If it's acceptable for you to create requirements for me, then it's acceptable for me to create requirements for you. That's not the same thing at all, Amanda protested, but her voice lacked its earlier authority. Isn't it? I asked genuinely. You just spent 2 hours explaining how husbands need structure and oversight, how they can't be trusted to make good decisions without guidance. Well, I'm applying that same logic to wives who think they have the authority to redesign other people's marriages without consultation. My wife was starting to look panicked. Rob, this was just a fun project. We weren't being completely serious about everything. I picked up their notebook and flipped through the pages of carefully written guidelines, complete with implementation strategies and enforcement mechanisms. This looks pretty serious to me. Multiple pages of detailed requirements, punishment systems, even plans for community-wide implementation. That's not the kind of thing people do for fun. We were just brainstorming, Rachel said quickly. It wasn't meant to be taken literally. That's interesting, I said, setting the notebook back down. Because when you were explaining how to use social pressure and accountability systems to ensure compliance, it sounded very literal to me. I walked back to my chair, but didn't sit down. Instead, I leaned against it casually, like we were having a pleasant conversation about the weather. Here's what I find fascinating about this whole situation, I continued. You all seem to think that creating guidelines for husbands was not only acceptable, but necessary. You were excited about it, energized by the idea of having that kind of influence. But the moment I suggest the same approach might apply to you, suddenly it's unreasonable. The room was getting smaller by the second. These women who'd been so confident in their authority just minutes ago were now fidgeting uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. So let me clarify my guideline, I said, straightening up. Any woman who believes she has the right to create behavioral requirements for her husband has automatically consented to having behavioral requirements created for her. It's only fair, right? Equal treatment and all that. You can't be serious about this, Jess whispered. Why not? I asked with genuine curiosity. You were serious about yours. You had 20 guidelines ready to implement, complete with consequences for noncompliance. You were planning to share this system with other wives, create a whole network of enforcement. That sounds pretty serious to me. Amanda found her voice, though it came out smaller than before. It's different when it's the other way around. How so? I pressed. Please explain the difference to me. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you think rules and control are great ideas when you're the ones wielding the power, but suddenly become unfair when someone else might have that same power over you. No one had an answer for that. They couldn't explain why their authority was legitimate while mine was not, without admitting the whole thing was about dominance rather than improvement. I let the silence stretch for a moment before delivering the final piece of my strategy. Now, since we're all about fairness and transparency here, I think your husbands should have the opportunity to review your guideline development project. They should know that their wives have been meeting secretly for 6 weeks to create systems for controlling them. Don't you think they deserve that transparency? The panic in the room was immediate and electric. These women who'd been so bold about managing their husbands suddenly looked terrified at the thought of their husbands finding out what they'd been planning. You wouldn't, Jess said, her voice barely audible. I smiled and pulled out my phone with the casual confidence of someone about to order pizza. Watch me. The reaction was instantaneous. 5 women who'd been smugly confident moments before were now staring at my phone like it was a loaded weapon. Wait, Rachel said, her voice climbing an octave. You don't need to involve anyone else in this. Why not? I asked, scrolling through my contacts. You were just talking about community accountability and getting other wives involved to make sure the guidelines stick. I'm just expanding the community to include the husbands. Amanda started to get up from her chair. Now hold on, Rob. There's no need to make this into a bigger issue than it needs to be. Bigger issue? I asked, holding my phone where they could all see it. I thought this was about improving marriages. Shouldn't improving marriages be something husbands would want to know about? My husband will kill me if he finds out about this, Nicole said, her voice tight with panic. Kill you? I raised an eyebrow. That seems like an extreme reaction to finding out his wife wants to improve their marriage. Unless, of course, he wouldn't see it as improvement. I found the contact I was looking for. Rachel's husband, Mike, who coached Little League Baseball and had always struck me as a reasonable guy. Probably had no idea his wife had spent her Saturday mornings plotting his behavioral modification. Let's start with Mike, I said, showing the screen to Rachel. He seems like the type who'd appreciate transparency in his marriage. No, Rachel practically shrieked. He'll think I'm completely insane. Why would he think you're insane? I asked innocently. These are just helpful suggestions for creating a better partnership, right? Kelly, who had been edging toward the door, froze when she realized I was holding everyone accountable, not just the married women. I should probably get going. This isn't really my business anyway. Oh, but it is your business, I said, turning my attention to her. You contributed several guidelines to this system. And more importantly, you've been giving relationship advice to married women despite never having successfully maintained a long-term relationship yourself. Don't you think that's something worth discussing? She was trapped between wanting to flee and not wanting to make sudden movements that might trigger me to actually make the call. Look, Amanda said, trying to regain some authority in the situation. We can all just forget this happened. Put the phone away and we'll pretend this conversation never took place. Pretend what never happened? I asked. The part where you and your friends spent 6 weeks creating a system to control and humiliate your husbands, or the part where you planned to implement it without their knowledge or consent. We weren't trying to humiliate anyone, Jess said, tears starting to form in her eyes. Really? I picked up their notebook again and started reading from their notes. Weekly performance reviews with grading systems. Privilege revocation for noncompliance. Social pressure campaigns involving other couples. This isn't relationship improvement, Jess. This is systematic humiliation disguised as self-help. I held up my phone again, finger hovering over Mike's contact. You know what? I think I'll call him first. Get his perspective on guideline number 12 about mandatory household chores with point systems and consequences. Stop, Rachel shouted. I'll do anything. Please don't call him. The desperation in her voice was exactly what I'd been waiting for. These women who'd been so eager to exercise power over their husbands were completely falling apart at the thought of facing any consequences for their actions. Anything? I asked. That's a big word. What exactly are you offering? She looked around at her friends for support, but they were all too busy trying to save their own situations to help her. I'll throw away my notes. We'll never talk about this again, she said. That's a start, I acknowledged. But it doesn't address the fundamental problem here. You all thought you had the right to redesign your marriages without consulting your partners. That's not a notebook problem. That's a respect problem. Amanda was trying a different approach. Look, Rob, we were just venting. You know how women get together and complain about their husbands. It's normal. Is it normal to create detailed enforcement strategies? I asked, flipping through their materials again. Because this looks less like venting and more like a business plan for domestic tyranny. I stood up and walked toward the front door, still holding my phone. Here's what's going to happen. Amanda, you have exactly 10 minutes to collect your materials and leave my house. If you ever attempt to interfere in my marriage again, I'll make sure every person in your social circle knows exactly what you've been doing here. Amanda's face went pale. You can't be serious. Number 1, I said, using the authoritative tone she'd been employing all afternoon. He needs to get your okay before making any decisions that affect the household, your schedule, or your resources. I paused, letting her own words hang in the air. That's what you said, isn't it, Amanda? She nodded reluctantly. Well, number 1, you need to start packing. If you think it's acceptable to come into my home and teach my wife how to control me, you've fundamentally misunderstood your place in our marriage. The way all that confidence drained out of them was instant. Amanda's authoritative posture collapsed completely. The other women looked between Amanda and me, suddenly realizing they'd crossed a line they hadn't fully considered. I want to understand something. I continued, my voice calm but carrying absolute authority. You've spent 6 weeks developing a system to control your husbands. Have any of you discussed this with them? Have you considered what happens when they find out their wives have been secretly planning their behavioral modification? Each woman began to realize the personal implications of what they'd been doing. Rachel was probably thinking about Mike's reaction to feeling controlled. Nicole was realizing her already strained marriage couldn't handle this level of deception. Kelly was understanding that she'd been giving advice about relationships she'd never successfully maintained. Here's what I find most interesting about this situation, I said, opening the front door wide. You all thought that creating rules for husbands was not only acceptable but necessary. You had enforcement strategies, implementation timelines, even plans for community-wide adoption. But the moment someone suggests you might be subject to the same treatment, suddenly it's unreasonable and unfair. I looked at each woman in turn. That tells me everything I need to know about your respect for your marriages and your husbands. The friends started gathering their materials quickly, each making brief, embarrassed apologies as they headed for the door. The group dynamic that had seemed so strong when they were creating their guidelines completely collapsed when they realized there might be consequences for their actions. Amanda was the last to leave, stopping at the door to make one final attempt at controlling the narrative. Are you going to tell our husbands about this? She asked nervously. That depends, I said. Are you going to give me a reason to? She shook her head quickly and hurried out to her car, leaving behind several pages of notes in her rush to escape. I closed the door and turned to face my wife, who was still sitting in the living room surrounded by the scattered remains of their relationship improvement project. She looked lost and ashamed, like someone who'd just woken up from a dream and realized it was actually a nightmare. I'm sorry, she said finally. I don't know what I was thinking. You were thinking you could get away with disrespecting me because you had backup, I said calmly. You were thinking that as long as other people validated your behavior, it was acceptable. She nodded, tears starting again. How do we fix this? We fix it by you understanding that this marriage works because we respect each other, I said. The moment you decided I needed to be managed and controlled was the moment you stopped being my partner and started being my adversary. I walked over to where the torn pages and scattered notes lay on the floor. Help me clean this up, and while we're doing it, you can explain to me how you're going to make sure something like this never happens again. As we knelt together, picking up the pieces of their ridiculous guideline system, I realized this had been more than just shutting down a power grab. It had been a reminder of who I was and what I was willing to accept in my life. I got caught up in the excitement, Jess said quietly as we worked. Amanda made it sound so smart and sophisticated, like we were being proactive about our relationships instead of just letting problems develop. And what problems were you trying to prevent in our marriage? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. I guess I felt like I didn't have enough control, like things happened to me instead of being decided with me. So instead of talking to me about feeling powerless, you decided to make me powerless instead? That wasn't my intention, she said, but her voice was small. Maybe not your conscious intention, I said, but that's what your actions accomplished. You spent 6 weeks in secret meetings learning how to control me instead of 5 minutes having an honest conversation about feeling out of control yourself. We finished cleaning up the scattered papers in silence. When everything was back in order, I sat down across from where Jess was still kneeling on the floor. Here's what we're going to do, I said. First, you're going to cut contact with Amanda completely. She's poison for our marriage and for any marriage. Second, if you have concerns about our relationship, you bring them to me directly, not to your friends, not to a book club, not to anyone else. Third, you're going to think very carefully about why you thought it was acceptable to participate in planning my humiliation. It wasn't supposed to be humiliation, she protested weakly. Weekly performance reviews, Jess. Point systems for household chores. Requiring permission for purchases over $100. What would you call that? She didn't have an answer. The thing that bothers me most about this whole situation isn't even the guidelines themselves, I continued. It's that you were excited about it. You were proud of what you'd created. You genuinely thought you'd found a way to improve our marriage by diminishing me. I'm sorry, she whispered. Sorry isn't enough, I said. Sorry is what you say when you accidentally break something. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate choice to prioritize your friend's validation over your husband's dignity. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet Saturday afternoon neighborhood. Normal people doing normal things, not sitting around creating systems for controlling their spouses. Do you want to save this marriage? I asked without turning around. Yes, she said immediately. More than anything. Then you need to understand something fundamental about me, I said, turning back to face her. I'm not a project to be improved. I'm not a problem to be managed. I'm your partner, and if you can't treat me like an equal, then we don't have a marriage worth saving. She was crying openly now, but I wasn't finished. Some women think being a good wife means being accommodating to the point of self-destruction, I said. But real partnership isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about respecting each other enough to be honest about what you will and won't accept. I sat back down across from her. I will not accept being managed like a child. I will not accept having my behavior monitored and graded. I will not accept having my marriage decisions made by committee. And I will not accept having my wife participate in planning my humiliation, regardless of how it's packaged or who encourages it. I understand, she said. Do you? Because 6 weeks ago you understood that we were partners, and somehow you ended up in my living room with a point system for my household contributions. She was quiet for a long time, thinking through everything that had led to this moment. I felt invisible, she said finally, like I didn't matter in the big decisions. And when Amanda started talking about taking charge of our relationships, it felt empowering, like I was finally going to have a voice. And it never occurred to you to use your voice with me? I was afraid you'd dismiss my concerns. So instead of risking a difficult conversation with your husband, you decided to participate in a secret project to control him. When she put it like that, the absurdity of her choice was obvious even to her. What happens now? She asked. Now you decide who you want to be, I said. You can be the woman who stands up for herself by tearing down her husband, or you can be the woman who builds a stronger marriage by addressing problems directly and honestly. I stood up and headed toward the kitchen. I'm going to make some coffee and give you time to think. When I come back, I want to hear your plan for making sure nothing like this ever happens again. As I prepared the coffee, I reflected on what had just transpired. It wasn't enough to just shut down their ridiculous guideline system. Jess needed to understand why she'd been vulnerable to Amanda's influence in the first place, and what she was going to do to address the underlying issues that had made her think controlling me was preferable to communicating with me. When I returned to the living room with 2 cups of coffee, Jess was sitting on the couch with a notepad, writing. What's that? I asked, settling into my chair. My plan, she said, for rebuilding trust and making sure this never happens again. She had written 3 main points. End all contact with Amanda and anyone else who encourages disrespect in marriage. Establish weekly check-ins where we both share concerns about our relationship directly with each other. Work on my own confidence and communication skills so I don't need outside validation for my feelings about our marriage. It's a start, I said after reading her notes. But I think you're missing something important. What? An understanding of why this happened in the first place, I said. You say you felt invisible and powerless, but we've been married for 8 years. In all that time, have I ever refused to listen when you've brought concerns to me? She thought about it carefully. No, you haven't. Have I ever dismissed your feelings or told you your concerns weren't valid? No. Then why did you believe Amanda when she told you that taking control was better than having conversations? It was the key question, and she needed to answer it honestly if we were going to move forward. Because she made it sound like I was being weak by not taking charge, Jess said slowly. Like I was letting myself be taken advantage of by being collaborative instead of commanding. And you believed that collaboration was the same as being taken advantage of? In that moment, with all of them agreeing and sharing their own examples, it started to make sense, she said. It felt like I'd been naive to trust that things would work out through discussion. I set down my coffee and leaned forward. Jess, do you realize what you just said? You admitted that you let a group of people convince you that trust and collaboration were weaknesses. You let them convince you that your marriage was broken and needed to be fixed through control and management. I know, she said quietly. It sounds insane when I say it like that. It doesn't sound insane, I corrected. It sounds like you got caught up in groupthink and lost sight of what actually matters in a relationship. I picked up her notepad and added a 4th point. Recognize that outside opinions about our marriage are less important than what actually happens between us. The most important thing you can do moving forward, I said, is remember that other people's problems with their marriages don't define problems in our marriage. Amanda's bitterness about her divorce doesn't mean there's something wrong with our relationship. Nicole's struggles with communication don't mean we have communication problems. I think I got seduced by the idea that we could prevent problems before they started, Jess said. By creating different problems, I pointed out. You were so worried about potential issues that you created actual issues. We spent the next hour talking through what had really been bothering her about our relationship. Most of it came down to wanting more involvement in financial planning and feeling like social decisions were made without enough input from her. All legitimate concerns that could have been addressed through simple conversations. Why didn't you just tell me you wanted more say in how we handle the budget? I asked, because I thought you'd think I was being controlling or demanding. So instead you joined a group that taught you how to actually be controlling and demanding? The irony wasn't lost on either of us. By the time we finished talking, it was evening. We'd spent the entire afternoon dealing with the consequences of her 6 weeks of secret meetings, but I felt like we'd actually made progress toward understanding each other better. I need you to know something, I said as we were cleaning up our coffee cups. This can't happen again. Not in any form, not with any group, not under any circumstances. If you ever again participate in planning how to control or manage me, this marriage is over. I understand, she said. And I need you to know that I'm ashamed of what I did. Not just because it backfired, but because it was wrong from the beginning. Good, I said. Because shame is appropriate here. You violated the basic foundation of our marriage, and it's going to take time to rebuild the trust you damaged. How long? She asked. However long it takes, I said. Trust isn't rebuilt through apologies and promises. It's rebuilt through consistent, respectful behavior over time. As we turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I realized that this experience had clarified something important for both of us. Marriage isn't about finding ways to control each other. It's about building a life together based on mutual respect and shared decision-making. The moment one partner decides the other needs to be managed or improved is the moment the partnership ends and the power struggle begins. Some people think being a good husband means being accommodating to the point of self-destruction. But real strength isn't about avoiding conflict when the people who should respect you most try to tear you down. It's about standing up for yourself and your relationship when it really matters. Jess learned that lesson today. And more importantly, so did I. Dear listeners, that's our ending. If it resonated, subscribe to support the channel. See you next time.